The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains as Daniel groggily swung his legs over the side of the bed. Life had been a monotonous grind for the 34-year-old, who worked long shifts at the shipping docks. His days were filled with the thunderous roar of machinery and the salty scent of the ocean. He loved the physicality of his work, but it left little room for self-care. This particular Tuesday morning started no differently, except for a slight sting in his foot. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Pulling on his work boots, Daniel noticed a small, almost imperceptible cut on his heel. The injury was likely the result of stepping on a stray nail or splinter while unloading cargo the previous day. It wasn't deep, just a thin line that oozed a drop of blood. He shrugged it off. A man like Daniel didn't have time to fuss over such trivial wounds. With a quick dab of a tissue and a careless shrug, he went about his day. By midweek, the cut hadn't crossed his mind again. The pain was minor and, in his opinion, hardly worth worrying about. He wrapped the wound with a piece of duct tape he had lying around, a temporary fix to keep his sock from rubbing against it too much. But as the week wore on, so did the nagging discomfort. By Friday, a dull ache throbbed through his foot, and the cut, which he now remembered, had become an angry red line. Even then, Daniel didn't consider it serious. A man like him didn't run to doctors for every scrape and bruise. He reasoned it would heal in its own time. After all, he'd endured worse injuries during his years at the docks. The weekend came and Daniel spent it nursing beers with his buddies, never once considering that something as insignificant as a cut could be a problem. By Monday morning, something had shifted. His foot was swollen, the skin around the wound stretched taut and hot to the touch. A faint line of red streaked upward, creeping along his ankle and toward his calf. Daniel winced as he tried to put on his boots, the pressure causing sharp pain to radiate through his leg. Still, he hesitated to seek medical help. Work was piling up, and he didn't want to risk losing his hours. Instead, he made do. Limping through his shift, Daniel ignored the concerned glances of his coworkers and the persistent gnawing ache in his foot. But by the end of the day, his leg had begun to throb with such intensity that he struggled to climb into his truck. That night, as he peeled off his sock, the sight made his stomach churn. The area around the cut had turned a sickly purple, and the once small wound now oozed a foul-smelling yellow liquid. Sleep, however, didn't come easy. The throbbing in his foot grew unbearable, and he was haunted by vivid dreams where the infection seemed to take on a life of its own. In one dream, vines sprouted from the cut, twisting and curling up his leg like parasitic tendrils. He woke in a cold sweat, his sheets soaked, and the pain in his foot now a searing burn. Morning light revealed the horrifying reality. The red streak climbing his leg had grown darker, nearly black, and the swelling made his skin appear grotesquely distorted. Fever gripped him, his body trembling with chills despite the heat radiating from his infected limb. When he unwrapped the gauze, his stomach heaved. The wound had expanded, and the surrounding skin was covered in strange, blister-like bumps that oozed the same yellowish pus. The doctors and nurses poked, prodded, and questioned him relentlessly. How long had he noticed the cut? When did the symptoms start? Why had he waited so long? Their reprimands blurred together as the fever clouded his thoughts. Blood tests were ordered, and swabs were taken from the wound. He overheard snippets of their conversations. Words like necrosis, sepsis, and amputation floated ominously through the air. Daniel's heart sank as the lead doctor approached him with a grave expression. "You have a severe bacterial infection," she explained. "It's spreading fast. We need to act immediately to stop it from reaching your bloodstream, or it could be fatal." The word fatal jolted him into full awareness. The next hours were a whirlwind. Intravenous antibiotics were administered, and he was prepped for surgery to remove the dead tissue from his foot. But even after the procedure, the infection's progression seemed unstoppable. The doctors soon identified the culprit, a rare and aggressive strain of flesh-eating bacteria. It had likely entered his body through the seemingly innocuous cut days ago. Despite their best efforts, Daniel's condition worsened. The infection didn't just destroy tissue, it seemed to mutate. His leg became a grotesque landscape of blackened flesh and bulbous growths, each more horrifying than the last. His body fought valiantly, but the bacteria spread faster than the medical interventions could halt it. As he lay in the sterile confines of his hospital bed, a terrifying realization dawned on him. The wound wasn't just physical. The bacteria seemed almost sentient, as if it thrived on his fear and despair. Nurses whispered about the peculiar nature of his infection, its unresponsiveness to even the most potent treatments, and the way it seemed to defy all medical logic. Weeks turned into a nightmarish blur. Despite multiple surgeries to amputate increasingly larger sections of his leg, the infection continued its relentless march. Daniel's once strong body grew frail, his spirit worn thin by the unyielding pain and the horrifying transformation of his flesh. He became a medical curiosity, with specialists from around the country consulting on his case, but no one had answers. Eventually, the bacteria's growth slowed, but not because it had been defeated. It stopped only after consuming nearly everything below his knee. By then, Daniel was unrecognizable, his rugged confidence replaced by a haunted, hollow gaze. He was alive, but barely. The infection had left him physically and emotionally scarred, a stark reminder of how something so small, a simple cut, could spiral into a living nightmare. Months later, as he adjusted to life with a prosthetic leg and the lingering trauma of his ordeal, Daniel couldn't shake the memory of that tiny wound. It had seemed so insignificant at the time, an almost laughable inconvenience in the grand scheme of his busy life. But the horrifying aftermath was a grim lesson he would carry forever. Sometimes, the smallest things can grow into monsters. As Daniel sat in the dimly lit room of his modest apartment, the sound of his prosthetic leg tapping against the floor was a constant reminder of everything he had endured. The infection was behind him now, at least in a physical sense, but the scars ran far deeper than the flesh it had consumed. He had lost not only part of his body, but also a piece of himself, and the mental and emotional toll of his ordeal lingered like a shadow. His family and friends tried to support him in the weeks following his discharge from the hospital, but their concern often felt more suffocating than comforting. Everyone seemed to tiptoe around the subject of his amputation, their eyes filled with pity. He hated it. Daniel didn't want their sorrow or their half-hearted reassurances that everything would be fine. He wanted his life back, the one he had before that cursed cut had derailed it. For weeks, he barely left his apartment. He stared at the walls, watching shadows stretch and shrink as the days bled into nights. His once broad shoulders slumped under the weight of memories he couldn't shake. The throbbing pain of his infected leg, the sterile smell of the hospital, the doctor's grave expression as she told him the bacteria had taken more of his flesh. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were plagued by visions of the infection. In his mind, it wasn't just bacteria, it was alive, sentient, a malicious force that had fed on him and reveled in his suffering. He'd wake drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as though the infection was still clawing its way up his body. The nights became an extension of the nightmare he lived during the day, and Daniel began to dread the approach of sleep as much as he feared the waking hours. One afternoon, as the sunlight filtered weakly through his apartment window, Daniel decided he couldn't continue like this. He couldn't keep wallowing in fear and self-pity, replaying the horrors of the past over and over in his mind. If he ever wanted to reclaim any semblance of his former self, he needed to confront what had happened and figure out a way to move forward. But how could he possibly do that when the very thought of his injury sent a chill down his spine? He decided to start small. He pulled out a notebook and a pen, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold. At first, the blank page stared back at him, mocking his inability to put words to his thoughts. Then, slowly, he began to write. He wrote about the day he first noticed the cut, about his stubborn refusal to seek help, about the infection's relentless spread, and the surgeries that had stolen more and more of his leg. He wrote about the fear, the pain, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had consumed him. The act of writing was cathartic. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to truly feel the emotions he had buried beneath layers of stoicism and denial. He wrote for hours, pouring every ounce of his anger, grief, and frustration onto the pages, until his hand cramped and the words blurred before his tired eyes. As the days went on, Daniel's writing evolved. He began to explore not just the physical and emotional trauma he had experienced, but also the deeper questions that lingered in his mind. Why had this happened to him? Was there something he could have done differently? And most haunting of all, was the infection truly gone? Or was it still lurking somewhere, waiting to strike again? One evening, as he sat on the couch watching the flickering glow of the television, he noticed an odd sensation in his remaining foot. It wasn't pain exactly, more of a faint, tingling itch that seemed to radiate from the skin. His heart began to race as memories of the first cut flooded back. Was this how it had started before? Was it happening again? Daniel tried to push the thought away, telling himself it was nothing, but the itch persisted. Over the next few days, it grew more intense, spreading up his leg until it felt like his skin was crawling with invisible insects. He examined his foot obsessively, searching for any sign of redness, swelling, or a new wound, but there was nothing, just unblemished skin. Still, the sensation refused to go away. As the itching grew worse, so did Daniel's paranoia. He started avoiding mirrors, afraid of what he might see in his reflection. In his mind, the infection was no longer just a physical ailment. It was something far more sinister, something that defied explanation. He began to wonder if it was even possible to truly rid himself of it, or if it had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his being. Desperate for answers, Daniel turned to the internet, scouring forums and medical websites for any information about infections like his. He read about others who had survived flesh-eating bacteria, their stories filled with harrowing details of near-death experiences and long recoveries. But none of them described the lingering itch or the sense of something still lurking beneath their skin. Late one night, Daniel stumbled across an obscure blog written by a man who claimed to have experienced a similar infection. The man described how, even after the bacteria had been eradicated, he felt as though it had left something behind, an invisible mark that couldn't be erased. The man called it the ghost of the infection, a term that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. According to the blog, the only way to truly rid oneself of the infection's ghost was to confront it head-on, to face the trauma and accept it as part of one's story rather than something to be feared or erased. It sounded like nonsense, but Daniel couldn't deny that the words resonated with him. He had spent so much time running from what had happened, trying to bury it, that he hadn't truly processed it. Maybe that was why the itch persisted, because the infection wasn't just in his body, it was in his mind. Determined to confront his fears, Daniel decided to return to the shipping docks where he had worked before the infection. It was a place he had avoided since his ordeal, unwilling to face the memories associated with it. But if he was ever going to move on, he needed to reclaim that part of his life. As he walked along the docks, he found himself drawn to the spot where he had likely sustained the original cut. The memory of that day was hazy, but standing there brought it rushing back with startling clarity. He remembered the sharp sting of the nail, the drop of blood that he had dismissed as insignificant. He closed his eyes, letting the memory wash over him, and for the first time, he didn't try to push it away. In that moment, something shifted. The itch that had plagued him for weeks began to fade, replaced by a sense of calm he hadn't felt in months. It wasn't a cure, and it didn't erase what had happened, but it was a start. Daniel realized that he couldn't undo the past, but he could choose how he carried it with him. The infection might have left its mark, but it didn't have to define him. Over the following months, Daniel continued to confront his fears, pushing himself to rebuild the life he had nearly lost. He returned to work at the docks, adapting to the challenges of his prosthetic leg. He reconnected with friends and family, opening up about his experiences in a way he never had before. And though the memories of his ordeal would always be with him, they no longer held the same power over him. Daniel's journey wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But with each step forward, he proved to himself that he was more than his scars. The infection had taken so much from him, but it hadn't taken everything. He was still here, still fighting, and that was enough. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that he could heal, even if the process was slow and imperfect. The ghost of the infection still lingered, but Daniel had learned to live with it. It was a part of his story, a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything and how far he had come since. And as he stood on the docks watching the sun dip below the horizon, he knew that he was stronger than he had ever been. The infection had tried to destroy him, but it had only made him more determined to survive. As Daniel stood on the docks, his silhouette bathed in the warm hues of the setting sun, he felt an unfamiliar sense of balance. It wasn't physical. He was still adapting to his prosthetic leg, but emotional. It had been a long, arduous journey to reach this point, and the road ahead wasn't entirely clear, but for the first time, he felt as though he had regained a semblance of control over his life. The people around him began to notice the shift. His co-workers, once hesitant to engage with him after his ordeal, started treating him with the same camaraderie they always had. They'd tease him about his stubbornness or share a laugh about the quirks of their work. Those moments, so seemingly ordinary, held immense significance for Daniel. They reminded him that while he had changed, the world around him hadn't left him behind. It was during one of these casual conversations that Daniel first heard about the upcoming docks renovation project. A new pier was being constructed, and volunteers were needed to help oversee the planning and logistics. It wasn't heavy physical labor, a fact Daniel couldn't ignore with his new limitations, but it was an opportunity to contribute. He hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready to take on such a visible role, but something in him urged him to say yes. In the weeks that followed, Daniel threw himself into the project. He pored over blueprints, organized schedules, and coordinated with engineers and suppliers. It was demanding work, but it gave him a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since his infection, he felt like he was building something, not just a pier, but a future. Through his work, Daniel also found himself connecting with others who had faced their own adversities. One of the engineers on the project had lost his hand in a car accident, and they bonded over their shared experiences of adapting to life with prosthetics. They spoke openly about their frustrations and triumphs, finding solidarity in their resilience. These conversations helped Daniel realize that his struggles, while unique to him, were part of a broader tapestry of human perseverance. On weekends, Daniel began speaking at community events, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. He spoke not of the infection's horrors, but of the lessons he had learned. The importance of listening to one's body, the strength found in vulnerability, and the incredible capacity humans have to rebuild. He was candid about his fears and failures, hoping his honesty might inspire others to confront their own challenges. As he spoke, he discovered a passion for connecting with others. His words resonated with people, from those facing medical crises to those simply struggling to find their way in life. Daniel's story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable hardship, there is a path forward. In time, the pier project was completed, and it stood as a testament to collective effort and determination. For Daniel, it symbolized something more personal, a tangible representation of his journey from despair to resilience. Standing on the new pier, watching the waves crash against its sturdy foundation, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just in the project but in himself. He had faced horrors he never thought possible and come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. The infection had left its mark on him, but it had also taught him that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about rebuilding, growing, and finding meaning in the scars. Daniel's life was forever changed, but it was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. As Daniel stood at the edge of the pier, the salty breeze brushing against his face, he felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The weight of his experiences had shifted, not vanishing but transforming into something he could carry with purpose. The sea stretched out before him, endless and unpredictable, much like the future. But instead of fearing it, he welcomed its uncertainty. In the months since the project's completion, Daniel had begun working with a nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness about preventable infections and amputations. He traveled to schools, community centers, and workplaces, using his story to educate others about the importance of early intervention and self-care. Each presentation was a chance to turn his pain into a force for good, to ensure others wouldn't endure what he had. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on ignoring small injuries like a cut on the foot? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.